Hello and welcome to another sewing video because it's Ren Fair season, and of all the things I have been at the Ren Fair, I have yet to be a pretty princess in a big hoop skirt, and it was time to change that by making Baby's First Ball Gown. For once in my life, I am being incredibly conscious of my limits and intentionally drafting the most standard ball gown that I can possibly make. I have never worked with this much fabric at once in my entire life, and needless to say, I found it incredibly intimidating. And to reduce my fear of working with so much fabric, I did a very sensible thing and split the dress into two parts, the top/bodice and the skirt. Not only does this help me not have to work with just the bulkiest amount of fabric constantly, but this also is just the way that I've seen most ball gowns are constructed anyways, and you know what, it makes a lot of sense as to why that would be the case. So my plans for the top include a sweetheart neckline and big full lantern sleeves, because if I'm designing an article of clothing that can have a poofy sleeve and I don't, just assume that I'm being held hostage or that I have been replaced by a clone. We're gonna hope for the second one because that would be a groundbreaking advancement for science. I also want the front waist section of the bodice to have corset boning channel details for a little visual interest, and the back to have a bunch of grommets and lacing for that corset style closure, because you know, a little leeway in sizing is good for me and my relationship with my body. The bottom is just going to be a big gigantic circle skirt with a ribbon tied closure around the waist. No zippers, no buttons, no lace, no gathering stitches, nothing crazy. I did very briefly consider giving it pockets, but ultimately decided against that on account of I forgot that I wanted to put pockets at all. So let's talk fabric. Now I know I literally just said in the last video and like all of this year that this is the season of finishing things and also using a bunch of fabric for my fabric stash. And here I am opening a brand new package of fabric, but in my defense, a ball gown is not exactly the kind of thing that you scrounge around your fabric stashes for, hoping to have enough to make something. Also, I had a very specific color palette in mind for this dress. So months ago, before we ever moved into this house, I purchased 11 yards of this absolutely gorgeous burgundy color shift taffeta, as well as 11 yards of a black sheer organza, with the plan to layer them to create the vampire ball gown dress of my dreams. Now, before I cut into this gorgeous fabric, and also because I was super nervous to get started anyways, I decided to do some maths and figure out if I actually had enough fabric to make all the necessary skirt panels. If you're making a circle skirt that is not intended to go over a hoop skirt and touch the ground, or at least if you are making a skirt that has a length of less than half the width of the fabric you've purchased, typically you'll fold your fabric into a square, calculate the radius of your waist by dividing 2π from the circumference measurement, mark your waist radius onto the fabric using the corner as an anchor, and then add your desired skirt length and a little bit for seam allowance, once again marking that sum onto the fabric using the folded corner as an anchor. If that explanation made sense to you, congratulations, that's very astounding because I thought of those words all by myself and it's hard for me to follow. If it didn't make sense, that is okay. There are many a tutorial online that can help you with that stuff a lot better than me and my silly ramblings can. Now, my skirt was not shorter than half the width of the fabric I purchased, so I was not able to cut my circle skirt out in a single panel. So what I did was figure out how big of a fraction of a circle skirt I could fit onto the folded fabric, and then divide that from the total circle skirt to see how many panels I needed to cut out. In hindsight, I do think the fabric that I had was just under 60 inches wide, and because I am the same height as the elves in Santa's workshop, I did not need a full 60 inches of length to go from my waist to the floor, even with the addition of a hoop skirt. So if I had folded the fabric on the width instead of leaving it folded on the length, I could have done this in only 2 panels instead of 6, but I'm not gonna lie, my brain power is not at its finest at the moment. Also, I don't mind having 6 panels, it's not a loss to me. The extra seam lines don't bother me. If anything, they add a little character to the dress. So that is 6 panels out of taffeta and an additional 6 panels out of black organza, which is just a lot of fabric. But working on the skirt part of this dress was so instantly gratifying. I could just put on the hoop petticoat and and then hold up a panel to the skirt and immediately just be rewarded with a fraction, precisely 1/6 of the final product. And oh, you are so lucky that you get to watch this whole process sped up, because I really thought I could finish the skirt in one day. I'm gonna be honest, I probably could have if it was a better day for me, but it took so much time and energy to iron everything, let alone begin overlocking all the edges and sewing it together. Taffeta and organza both wrinkle pretty easily, and the creases that were there just from shipping and storage were very present. Luckily, because of the color shift illusion that both the taffeta and the organza have, you don't really see a lot of the wrinkles that happen as just a result of general movement, but I had hoped so very strongly that I wouldn't have to iron the seams flat and that the weight of the drape would just make up for it, but unfortunately that was very much not the case. So a lot of the time in this video is just dedicated to ironing every single piece to be nice and flat. And of course, the other thing that took forever was serging or overlocking the edges. I hate rethreading my serger. It is one of my least favorite things about sewing, which is why you've seen my serger loaded with 3 black spools and 1 white one, and I haven't changed that in months. But because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to hide the serged edge of my organza, I did actually make an extra effort to rethread my machine in order to make sure all of my spools of thread matched. And you better believe that I used a lot of thread just to make sure that every edge of every panel was properly serged, because both taffeta and organza are pretty fray prone materials. So after 3 years of overlocking the edges, I finally got to a point where I could sew panels together. Honestly, the most astounding part of this was that I never actually had to pull out a seam ripper to undo a panel because I accidentally sewed it on inside out. Oftentimes fabric will have a very obvious right side and wrong side, but both taffeta and organza look pretty similar on both sides. I think taffeta in general is ever so slightly less shiny on the wrong side, but with the fabric I purchased, I could not tell the difference. Even so, I did not sew the wrong sides together, and the not a perfect circle skirt was successfully completed with good length, so that is a success in my book. When sewing the final seam connecting the circle skirt, I didn't sew it all the way up. I left about a 6-inch gap from the waist so that I can slide it over my shoulders easy peasy without any struggle. Also, absolutely, I took every opportunity in the project that I could to put that hoop skirt back on and try the various layers. Folks, owning a hoop skirt or a petticoat, just any sort of structural underskirt thing, is such a game changer when it comes to costumes and also just feeling like a pretty princess in general. Would you like to be the prettiest girl at the party? The answer is to own a hoop skirt, baby. But not everything is sunshine and roses. I'm having organza and I hate it. And with this skirt, it was pretty unavoidable. Luckily, because of my foresight to change that 1 white spool of thread out, and also having a really nice overlocking stitch, as it stood, the hem really was not that ugly, so I just turned it like a regular hem instead of doing that fancy cut and turn and roll that people recommend you do when hemming sheer fabric. Proper hemming of sheer fabrics? I don't know her. For the red layer, I decided to fold the hem up more than just once, just because I cut both the taffeta and organza with the same measurements, and I wanted the red underlayer to be just the smallest smidgenest shorter than the taffeta layer. Also, in general, whenever I was trying the skirt on, it was really long. I thought surely a little extra length couldn't hurt in case of mistakes, but I was gently reminded that I'm very short and a little extra length is the fine line between an elegant dress and a tripping hazard. And the last finishing detail for the skirt was the waistband. I was just going to attach the layers together, gather it, and then attach it to a strip of fabric or ribbon, but instead I decided to create a little channel to thread a ribbon through to create a more adjustable waist, primarily because I could really stand to shorten the skirt once again by at least another inch or 2. I will always measure my pieces too big, it is a canon event. But after threading the ribbon through, it was time for one more try on of the skirt. Okay, so now onto the even more intimidating part of this project, the top. The top started with drafting a brand new Franken pattern by mushing together 2 patterns and then finagling it so that it would work the way that I wanted it to. The primary inspiration of this bodice is a sewing pattern that I love that you've seen before. It's Nomi's pattern ME 2021 by Gwen Hang. I love this pattern because of the way the sleeves look. I know how it fits me. I've put this pattern together I think 4 times already, and the overall familiarity with the piece makes the intimidating prospect of modifying a pattern a lot less intimidating. So using a full-length version of the Gwen Hang dress that I've made and I know fits me well. In addition to a pattern for a corset stays made by Meadow Patterns on Etsy, I drafted a sort of corset belt pattern piece to attach right under the bust of the original Gwen Hang pattern, and also marked out where I wanted the corset boning to possibly go. For the back, I kind of used the same corset piece, I just got rid of the point to measure out an extended version of the already existing back from the Gwen Hang pattern, and also to get rid of that empire waist. It was all pretty careful and precise, but the one sketchy thing that I did was in regards to the back piece. In the original dress, this back piece has a dart sewn into it, and I wasn't planning on taking that dart out, but since I lengthened the back piece, the dart had to be extended as well. Now, I've had zero formal training on pattern making, and to be honest, I just extended this dart based on vibes and what I felt like was an appropriate amount to take in. Now, the caveat to that being I would probably not ever do that, just place darts willy-nilly and extend them however I'd like, but I knew that this piece was going to have a corset back and that was going to give me a lot of wiggle room in terms of fit and sizing, so if I'm a little bit off, so be it. But with my new pattern pieces established, it was time to begin cutting pieces out. So for the two back panels and the waist section with boning, that was an inside lining layer, a structure layer for my boning, the taffeta layer, and the organza layer. For the bust area, that was just lining, taffeta, and organza, and for the two beautiful sleeves and cuffs, just taffeta and organza. I keep saying just, but that's a total of 19 differently cut pieces that also needed to be ironed and serged. That is not an insignificant amount. In general, this whole project used a lot of thread. I did have to actually replace one of the spools on my serger. I used up an entire spool of black thread on my regular sewing machine, and I had to refill my bobbin, I think, 4 times over the course of this project, which for some of y'all might not be that much, but for me, I'm not used to refilling my bobbin more than once, maybe twice for a single project. And the last step to making sure all of my pieces were properly prepped was to cut out the boning and attach it to my structure layer. I originally cut out 10 pieces for the front because I thought I wanted more corset channel details on the sides as well, but in the end I scrapped these side corset channels and just went with the 2 in the center and 2 coming out from each side at an angle. And I am using a zigzag stitch sewing directly onto the boning. This particular kind of boning has a bunch of little holes in it. It is intended to be attached this way, and I hate sewing boning channels, so I just add seam lines that look like boning channels after the fact. And now with all of the pieces finally prepped, we can start sewing the various layers together. So the organza layer gets sewn onto the taffeta layer, and then those get sewn onto the structure layer, and it is at this point where you can start putting the darts in so you get nice clean seams. The only place that I didn't sew the organza layer down to the taffeta layer before the construction was in the sleeves. I wanted the sleeve layers to be able to move independently from each other, more or less, except for where it was gathered around the wrist and the shoulder. But with those layers together, I could finally start actually assembling the bodice and putting this whole top together. So I first attached the bust section to the waist in the front, then sewed the sides together, then the shoulders, and repeated the process exactly the same for the inner lining. Pinning the lining layer to the bodice was very exciting. I was a little too excited to get onto that step. I actually caught myself because I almost pinned it on backwards, but not today, sewing imps. You will not have me pulling out the seam ripper on this project. Even though I didn't pull out the seam ripper for any backwards sewing mistakes, I did stab myself at least 30 times with all the many pins this project took. So I think that was the blood price paid for not having to use my seam ripper. After sewing the lining and the bodice front together, I pulled out the serger one last time to serge the bottom hem together to create a nice and neat and smooth curve. The serger very conveniently has a little blade that can be flipped down to cut off the excess fabric that is going into the serger, and that blade is strong. She can cut through pretty much any amount of fabric that I've given her, and this gave me a much nicer, more secure edge than if I had done a straight stitch with the machine or if I had cut the hem with scissors, and I could very easily cover up the little serge seams with a tiny bit of black satin bias tape, and bada bing, bada boom, we have a nice, beautiful, perfect edge. No folding, no ironing, no trimming excess. Bias tape is the best. And after that, all I had left to do was attach the sleeves and cuffs and also stab myself with pins another 43 times. This part is the same as it always is. Make a gathering stitch on either end and do a whole lot of pinning and praying that your needle doesn't break as it chugs its way through 6 layers of fabric. And last but not least is the perfect opportunity to vent out all your frustrations with this project and hammer in some grommets. Actually, I've really been considering getting like a grommet press. I've seen those in some videos and I put in a lot of grommets. There are 26 grommets in this piece alone, and this is not the only corseted back project that I've made. That being said, I have seen a lot of mixed reviews regarding grommet presses, so I'm a little hesitant at the moment, but with those grommets installed, I think we're ready for the reveal. I'm really noisy, so I do apologize for that. But in closing, I'm obsessed. I feel like something has come to fruition. Something that was meant to be has happened. I love the dress. It's such a nice step, small step, reasonable step at the very least, into being more comfortable, making bigger, more complicated pieces. I am super proud of myself for the patterning that I did for the top. I love the way that the taffeta and the organza layer, it's exactly what I envisioned. The fullness, the length, everything about it is incredible. As always, I do have a couple of critiques. My seams are nowhere near perfect, especially on the front where the faux boning channels are. Some of those are a little sad and crooked, and I could have admittedly done a better job on that, but I am not like that. The biggest thing that I'm kind of bummed about is that I wanted this top to have additional wearability outside of just matching this dress. I love everything about it. It's very comfortable. It fits me very well, but I have a very difficult time putting it on by myself. So I think this will be a special occasion shirt, unfortunately. But all in all, I am very pleased with this dress. I'm so sure I've said this before, but every once in a while you complete a project that makes you feel like you've leveled up in your abilities. This dress in particular made me feel like I've allocated some points in my sewing skill tree. This isn't the most complicated thing I've ever made by a long shot, but it is very different from a lot of the things that I've made. Such a large amount of fabric was pretty new. Modifying patterns in that way was kind of new. I feel growth. I feel like I've branched out. And hopefully that means we'll be seeing more ball gowns in the future. Maybe more complicated ball gowns. But who knows? Not me.